Every day, millions of people around the world walk past a symbol they'd recognize instantly. A three-pointed star, gliding silently on the hood of a car. To most, it means one thing: money, power, success. It rides on the cars of presidents. It rides on the cars of movie stars. But almost nobody who sees that star knows the truth behind it. They don't know that the man who created it wasn't born into wealth at all. He was a boy who lost his father before he could even remember his face, and grew up in a home with almost nothing. They don't know that the very name stitched into automotive history, a name spoken with reverence in every language on earth, once belonged to nothing more than a little girl. And almost nobody knows that this entire legend nearly died before it began, saved not by the man whose name it carries, but by a woman the world forgot to remember. Today, we're going back to where it all started, to a poor, broken home in 19th century Germany, to tell you the real story behind that star. And I promise you, by the end, you'll never look at it the same way again. The story begins on November 25, 1844, near Karlsruhe, Germany, where a boy named Karl Benz was born to an ordinary train engineer. Karl was barely 2 when his father caught a chill on the job and died, leaving the family without its breadwinner. He never knew his father's face. His mother was left alone with almost no money, but she made a decision that would echo through history, determined to give her son an education, whatever it cost her. She worked without rest, saved every coin, and poured what little she had into Karl's schooling, believing knowledge alone could pull him out of poverty. That quiet sacrifice became the true foundation of a global empire. Without her stubborn belief, Karl would likely have remained an anonymous, poor young man his whole life, and he never forgot what he owed her. From childhood, Karl was thoughtful and endlessly curious about how things worked. Poverty didn't break him. It hardened him, teaching patience and the discipline of making do with almost nothing. He was drawn to machines like a magnet, spending hours watching locomotives, taking apart clocks, building things with his hands, and bold ideas for machines that didn't exist anywhere on Earth were already forming in his mind. Thanks to his mother's sacrifices, Karl enrolled at a polytechnic school in Karlsruhe while still very young, sharp and diligent enough that his teachers predicted a strong future for him. It was during these years he dreamed something almost unthinkable, a carriage that could move on its own, without a horse. In an era when all transport depended on horses, the idea sounded borderline insane, and people laughed. Why invent something new, they asked, when the horse had served humanity for thousands of years? But Karl was convinced the future belonged to the machine, and the thought never left him. After his studies, Karl drifted between modest engineering jobs, scraping by while pushing toward his dream. In 1871, he opened his own small workshop in Mannheim, a humble shop destined to become the birthplace of an entire industry, though nobody could have imagined that then. Business was brutal from the start, money was tight, orders were scarce, and there were stretches when there wasn't even money for basic necessities, with creditors threatening to seize the workshop over unpaid debts. Partners who never believed in his obsession with a self-moving carriage abandoned him one by one, until he was almost entirely alone. And here's where our first myth needs correcting: the idea that Karl Benz built the automobile entirely alone. In 1872, he married a woman named Bertha, who became far more than a wife, his business partner and his greatest source of strength. She believed in her husband's dream even when almost nobody else did, and invested her own dowry into the failing workshop, money that repeatedly rescued it from collapse. Without those funds, the automobile might never have been born. Intelligent, brave, and decisive, she understood both the technical and business sides of the work, studied the drawings herself, and pointed out flaws. In an era when women were expected to stay confined to the household, she was a true co-creator of one of history's greatest inventions, and her role in this story is far from finished. After years of relentless effort and failure, Karl finally succeeded, building a reliable internal combustion engine and mounting it onto a lightweight three-wheeled carriage, with ignition, cooling, and a way to transfer power to the wheels. Nearly every piece solved for the first time in human history. This was the world's first true automobile, the patented motor car. On January 29, 1886, Karl received the patent, a date now recognized worldwide as the birthday of the automobile. Decades later, the descendants of that clumsy three-wheeler would fill every road on the planet, reshaping cities, distances, and daily life. A poor boy who grew up without a father built, with his own hands, a machine that would reshape the entire planet. You'd think fame would have followed instantly. That brings us to the second myth, that brilliant inventions are met with instant triumph. In reality, the world simply wasn't ready. Most people laughed at the strange, sputtering machine, calling it noisy, dangerous, and absurd. Horses panicked at the sight of it, and sales barely moved, because nobody understood why anyone would need this contraption when reliable horses already existed. Karl was shy and reserved by nature, far more comfortable with blueprints than with convincing a skeptical public, and the cold reception crushed him. He began doubting his own creation, and the business teetered on collapse again. Early demonstrations sometimes ended in embarrassment, the engine stalling or startling bystanders, drawing ridicule instead of admiration. What was needed was one bold, decisive act to prove the automobile was the future. And that act belonged to Bertha. What Bertha Benz did one August morning is now legendary. Without telling her husband, she took her two sons, quietly rolled the automobile out of the workshop at dawn, and set off on a journey of roughly 60 miles to visit her mother, the first long-distance road trip in automotive history, completed by a woman. Bertha understood that persuasion had already failed. What was needed was an action loud enough to speak for itself. The journey was full of obstacles, but her resourcefulness knew no limits. When a fuel line clogged, she cleared it with her own hairpin. When a wire sparked loose, she insulated it with a garter from her stocking. When the wooden brakes began failing on descents, she had a shoemaker in a roadside village nail leather onto them, essentially inventing the first brake pads on the spot. She bought fuel at a pharmacy stocking the right solvent, later recognized as the first fueling station in history. There were barely any roads, gas stations, or spare parts anywhere, and Bertha and her sons rode into total uncertainty on a fragile, untested machine, solving every crisis as it came. By evening, they reached their destination safely, and Bertha sent her husband a telegram announcing her triumph. Her daring trip proved, in a single day, what years of persuasion never could. The automobile was reliable, capable of real distances, and genuinely useful for everyday life. Newspapers picked up the story, genuine interest began to build, and orders slowly started coming in. What Karl couldn't accomplish in years of arguments, his wife achieved in one day of risk and determination. This fearless woman behind the wheel had saved the automobile, and her husband's entire life's work, from fading into nothing. That's exactly why it's so unfair that history remembers only Karl's name. Her journey told him exactly what needed improving, and every model that followed became more reliable. The workshop that once teetered on bankruptcy could barely keep up with new orders, and Karl's company grew rapidly, becoming the largest automobile manufacturer in the world by the turn of the century. The dream of a penniless boy had come true, and the poverty that haunted him since infancy was finally behind him. But the story wouldn't be complete without one more chapter, and that brings us to the third myth, that Karl Benz was the only man who invented the automobile. At almost the same time, roughly 60 miles from Mannheim, another German inventor named Gottlieb Daimler was working with his brilliant collaborator, Wilhelm Maybach, on high-speed gasoline engines of their own. While Benz set out to build a complete automobile, Daimler and Maybach focused on light, powerful engines that could be fitted onto almost anything, together laying the groundwork for the entire automotive industry. Remarkably, these two pioneers worked in the same country during the same years. Other plans. After a devastating war, Germany Pluniet reportedly never once met. More rivals than allies, which reveals another misconception, that Daimler and Benz were partners from the start. In truth, each man arrived at his invention independently, and for years their companies fought fiercely for the same customers, with no idea their futures would eventually merge into one legendary name. Now for one of the most fascinating secrets of all, where the name Mercedes actually came from, and another myth to bust, that it was named after a great engineer. Nothing could be further from the truth. Daimler's company had a wealthy customer and salesman named Emil Jelinek, a passionate lover of speed and racing, practically a one-man sales force promoting Daimler's cars among the elite and racing them himself under his daughter's name. At the start of the new century, he commissioned a powerful new car and insisted it be named after his young daughter, Mercedes. The car was a sensation, and the name quickly became attached to all of Daimler's vehicles. That's how one of the most famous brand names on Earth ended up belonging to a little girl who had nothing to do with engineering. Jelinek believed so deeply in the brand that he eventually added his daughter's name to his own surname, and young Mercedes could never have imagined that a century later, the world would still speak her childhood name with reverence. Two great companies, the humble creation of poor Karl Benz and the ambitious enterprise of Gottlieb Daimler, spent years on separate paths, competing fiercely. But history had get into economic catastrophe, currency lost value by the day, and selling expensive automobiles became almost impossible. Factories sat idle, and under those brutal conditions it made far more sense for two old rivals to join forces than to keep fighting alone. In 1926, the two companies merged, creating the company that would give the world the legendary name Mercedes-Benz. Joining the legacies of two men who never stood together in life, but whose achievements became permanently intertwined after it. On the emblem, Daimler's three-pointed star, symbolizing the dream of conquering land, sea, and air, was wrapped in Benz's laurel wreath, since becoming one of the most recognizable symbols on Earth. Karl Benz lived long enough to see his once-mocked invention grow into a massive global industry. The boy who grew up without a father, who endured poverty and ridicule, spent his final years surrounded by honor as the father of the automobile. He passed away on April 4, 1929, already regarded as one of the greatest inventors in history. And it all started with a poor, unknown boy who had nothing but a dream and a stubborn refusal to quit. Bertha Benz deserves her own special recognition, since her role remained overshadowed by her husband's for far too long. Only over time did the world truly appreciate what she had done, and today her famous route from Mannheim is preserved as a heritage trail people still drive in her honor. Without her dowry, her sharp mind, and that desperate, daring ride that proved the automobile's worth, neither the company nor the brand would ever have existed. Today, roads, schools, and awards carry her name, inspiring people everywhere, especially women daring to go where they were never expected to be welcome. A reminder that behind great achievements often stand the people whose names remain hidden in the shadows far too long. Behind the shine of that famous star, and behind the luxury of those expensive cars, there is no story of wealth or privilege at all. There's a story of a poor boy, a mother who believed in him against all odds, a fearless woman, and a stubborn dream stronger than every obstacle in its way. So how did a poor boy really build Mercedes-Benz? Not through money, connections, or luck, because he had none of those things. He built one of the greatest brands on Earth through sheer persistence, love for his craft, and the people who refused to stop believing in him. Nearly everything we assume about this brand turns out to be only half true. It wasn't built by one man, but by two rival companies. Its name came from a little girl, and it was saved from oblivion by a fearless woman whose name history nearly forgot. So the next time you see that three-pointed star, remember this dazzling legend began in a modest German home, where a fatherless boy and his mother dared to dream bigger than their circumstances allowed. Sometimes it's the people who start with almost nothing who give the world something truly extraordinary. And maybe that's where real greatness lies, not in being born at the top, but in starting at the bottom and climbing, relentlessly, until the whole world changes for the better. If you enjoy the video, please subscribe the channel and like the video. Thanks for watching.